this step actually, because as we've done group over the years, we am I right there, Pete?
Yeah, just go as you are, I'll adjust.
Yeah. This step is almost the most practical step. It's almost, you could say, least important step, because it feels just very much like and now we're going to launch weekly worship. You know, it feels just, but actually it's like every step. It's important for different reasons. It's important differently to some of the other steps, I think. And I was reflecting on how we might approach this idea of weekly gathered worship. And I think I'd say different things to different people. I think I've got a few friends in the Anglican Church who weekly worship is almost the be-all and end-all. Like it's almost all they spend their time thinking about is weekly worship, whether that's because they're very high in their churchmanship, or actually it's for other reasons. And you feel like if you were to separate the percentage of effort and time in that person, like loads of their time and effort and thought life would be committed to worship, to weekly worship. And then what I'd say to that person is, it's not as important as you think. But then equally, I was probably brought up and discipled in what I'd call like the missional church movement, which was, you know, we go to the edges of the earth to preach the gospel. But actually, for thinking about my discipleship upbringing, I probably would think Sunday worship wasn't as important. I'd be like, well, that's just sort of kind of what we do. But what's more important is that every day we're on fire for Jesus, communicating the gospel. We'll meet in our homes. We'll disciple people one-to-one. And I would say to me in that space, Sunday worship is more important than what you realise. Does that make sense? These almost, we come at this with different ideas. So it's probably worth recognising where you come from when it comes to weekly Sunday worship. But before we go any further, I thought I'd watch a bit of John Christ. He's this Christian comedian, and you might have seen this video before.
Might just need to on that remote control there.
Yeah.
Just press the source button up at that. Yeah, that's it.
And it comes up. Cool. So this is John Christ as a spoof pastor preparing for Easter services.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, listen up. This is Easter. Shuttles and golf carts in the parking lot. Now, as everyone in here, staff or volunteer, shared our graphically designed Easter invitation on their personal Instagram. This is for the kingdom. Who is trimming these hedges? A youth intern? For heaven's sakes. No, we don't have ministry time. We do have a petting zoo outside, though. Connect cards, connect cards, connect cards. Do we have the right mixture of haze in the fog machine? I mean, we don't need new members, but did we get the rose petals in the visitor parking spaces? We are pro-Jesus and pro-Easter Bunny. Donuts, check. Coffee, check. Make sure we have gluten-free communion, fat-free communion, Whole30 communion, vegan communion, paleo communion, general communion. Honestly, everybody needs to keep their phones out, because I will be saying some very tweetable quotes this morning. The Easter basket is full, but the tomb is empty. You can put your life back together when it is in pieces, and some of y'all are still focused on Reese's. We need more diversity up on that stage. This is Easter. No, the youth pastor cannot do announcements. That one minority guy that came one time, can we get him to do announcements? We don't want any visitor to feel uncomfortable in any way at any time, but we will ask them to fill out a connect card with their children's names and ages. I don't care what size the stage is, Becky. I need a rapper up there, a full choir, and 6 men dressed as Roman centurions. Why would you even ask about the worship set list? As Jesus paid it all, Christ alone, Christ is risen. Can we get that other worship leader that's a little bit more attractive? This is the best great team we have. Who trained these people? For one Sunday, please, can you just not be weird? Can we put her at the auxiliary door? Quit your ministry. Move these people out of here. We got a service starting in 15 minutes. Make sure all the visitors know that they are under no pressure to give, okay? But we'd love to see them come back, and if they do come back, we're starting a series on giving next week.
So what I'd love you to do is, maybe in 2 groups, maybe Linny and Cole could split up, because you...
No, we can.
I'd love you to do a case study on a church service that you've been part of. We've probably been a part of a whole stack, haven't we? So maybe just pick a few and have a think. And I'd love you to ask, as you think about that Sunday service, I'd love you to ask what was great about that Sunday service, what really worked, what you felt like was faithful, like, but what you felt like, what wasn't quite there, what could have been improved. And before we do that, I'm just going to read from Acts 2, passages we know very well. And this was the passage that when we started New Life, we really felt like the Lord laid on our hearts. And I think it's really appropriate, this, because Sunday worship is an expression of a New Testament community, isn't it? And so I'll just read this out. It's Acts 2, 42 to 47. And maybe as I'm reading this, be thinking about some of those worship gatherings that you've been part of, and whether it feels like what I'm about to read, and if it doesn't, why not? And if it does, why does it feel like this? So Acts 2. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favour with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Amen. So, two groups maybe.
Shall I come round then?
That's really helpful. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think when we're talking about Antioch steps, we've got a very clear idea of what that congregation is going to look like. And it's very easy to slip into thinking about other churches that are very different to us. And it's helpful, that comment, Colin, because King's Church, which is down the road from us, pulls in 1,200 people every week.
Wow.
Pastor Derek is a good friend of mine. Like the fabulous, godly people who are doing something very specific, but almost this whole REAP program is not addressing King's Church. It's got a very clear idea of what the congregations are going after are, and I think that's helpful to remember when we're thinking about launching public worship. And because we'll have some ideas we bring into that idea of launching public worship, and then there's lots of ways that our view of what weekly public worship should be will be informed, and that's why we start here. So I'm just going to share a few things that I'm not going to go through the document, the Step 8 document, but just some thoughts that I've been having this week, thinking about launching public worship. One thing I noted from the document that you should have there was this thing that me and John say, that when you gather like a launch team, the gap between the gathering of the launch team and the starting of Sunday worship shouldn't be too long. So we actually say between 6 to 9 months, because if you leave it longer than that, then the launch team are going to start asking questions. They're going to be thinking, well, when's this thing going to happen? This idea of starting worship, which I thought was interesting and helpful to remember, because me and Ames have planted 2 churches now, and in a way, being in our front room in that pre-launch period was a fabulous time. Like, it was, you were building culture, you were there for the same reason. It was really easy to run. You just opened your front door and turned the kettle on. You were worshipping together, you had food together. It's just a beautiful time. But it was not the end. It was just the means to the end, and it'd be so easy to stay there, even in our minds. And actually, there has to be a point where you're saying we're stepping out of our comfort zone into the world of public worship. It's interesting because you must know people, that I have friends who, I have one church I know in Cambridge, and they're an estate church. There is council estates in Cambridge, I'll let you know. And but they're really interested in the way they do public worship. It's very closed off. It's almost like a deposit of what was happening in the front room pre-launch into what happens every week. So newcomers do come, but it's just so closed off that And in one way, we're going to come onto this in a minute. I get why it's so exclusive, because for them it's like this is the body of believers, people who have come to Christ, and there's something very sacred about this community.
Yeah.
But then I imagine you can all think of other people who call something church that meets, and if we're frank, it's not church. It's social gathering is probably too harsh, but there isn't this going on in the gathering. There might be like a prayer somewhere, or there might be like Christians in the room, but it's just so fluid. Does that make sense? And it's sort of so for us, for example, when we do Messy Church in New Life, it's not a church service. It's an outreach from the church. But it's very tempting, I know colleagues of mine, even in Manchester Diocese, to call Messy Church a New Testament congregation. And I think Messy Church can be made into a New Testament congregation with the right leadership, actually, and the right devotion. But often it isn't that. It's a sort of it's a ministry of a local congregation. But I guess what I'm saying in all this is, it feels like there's a fine line when it comes to weekly worship. I hope you can see that. Like there's a fine line, and it's a balancing act, it feels like. And so the first point I was thinking of is that in Antioch, we want our weekly gathered worship gatherings to be accessible. That's the word, the key word that we use, accessible to someone who's been drawn to Jesus by the Father. So they feel able to come to that in some way or form. But that's something that we hold quite dear in Antioch. That I often talk about as a leader of New Life. I have one eye on the door when we're gathered for weekly worship. That I have one eye on the potential person who's coming in and what that would feel like for that newcomer. Like, what does it feel like? And it's really important. I think it's a really helpful exercise to do, actually. Just imagine what this would feel like. If you can't imagine it yourself, because you've been a Christian far too long, then ask someone what it feels like to come to your church. I did this with Oldham's Church, actually. A friend of ours, we got to know them on the estate, Lee and Lindsay they were called. They weren't Christians. I said, would you come to our church and tell us what it feels like? And they came with some really interesting ideas. They said things like, we think you should have it in rows because it feels a bit too scary, like the fact that we're facing each other a little bit, and that's scary actually for a newcomer. Which I thought was really interesting. And they said other things like that there's some things that we just miss because we're not newcomers, and we've not been newcomers for a long time. Here's what I don't mean though when we say accessible. I don't think Antioch is about being seeker friendly, actually. I actually don't think that's what we are. And what I mean by that is our whole weekly gathered worship is lean towards the newcomer. Does that make sense? That we've got our eye on the door, but what we're doing there is not for that person primarily, actually. I also don't think what we do in Antioch weekly gathered worship is trying to be relevant either. I'm a little bit done with that word now. Being brought up in the sort of missional church movement, which is all about relevancy and just getting the gospel as close as we can to people who are far off. And clearly that heart is godly and it's a good heart, but when it comes to weekly gathered worship, I'm not sure. So it'll be interesting for all of us to think about, what does it feel like for a newcomer to come to your gathered worship? Just imagine it now. And try and imagine, maybe you're going to have to imagine the newest person in the room and how it felt for that person. Like how did they respond coming in? And remember, one person's view is not exhaustive. It doesn't represent every newcomer. Because every person comes with a different background, a different fear dynamic, a different relationship with big groups even, sociologically speaking. So that's point one, accessible. And then point two, remember, we're talking fine lines. There's a fine line, isn't there, when it comes to accessible being like tipping this way into it feeling completely inaccessible to the newcomer, but then this way into it just being a bit of a social gathering so that anyone can come. We want to be here. And then the second point relates to that does the weekly gathered worship feel Christian? And that sounds a random thing to say, but I think it's tapping into that point I was making, that our gatherings should feel accessible, but they should also feel weird to a newcomer.
Yeah.
And in our church 2 weeks ago, we had 2 ladies come to church, didn't we? And they lasted 45 minutes, and then they left in the middle of the service. And part of us should feel a bit sad that they left, but also we should expect it. Because if you read here in verse 43, what does it say as Luke describes the early church? It doesn't say, and comfort came across every soul. It doesn't say they felt sociologically safe. It doesn't say that. It says awe. Awe came upon every soul. So there should be a sense that there's something weird about this. And it should stir. In some ways, we should expect people to leave the room after 45 minutes because it is like a strange thing. This is not like just a normal gathering in a room. Like we're expecting the living God of the universe to be present with us by His Spirit. And
Peter says to
Well,
the
you
one
think-
encounter with Jesus, "Go away from me, for I'm a sinful man."
yeah,
Now, ultimately, he's become the disciple, doesn't he? But in one of those encounters, it makes him so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
He feels the need for distance.
yeah,
Jesus obviously didn't sin, so it's not like he did it wrong.
no.
Well, they lasted 45 minutes because I did pray with them.
Yeah, you were next to them, weren't you?
You know, when you said turn to your
Yeah.
neighbour and pray, and this poor woman, she didn't. And I really, after they'd left, I just thought how weird. And then of course I found out actually they were there for another reason partly, weren't they?
Yeah.
And maybe they'd come to the wrong meeting
Yeah.
that CR was.
Yeah.
But I said, we just sort of prayed this. Is there anything bothering you that you'd like me to pray for?
Right.
Well, we talk, they said, and I thought, oh, right. And then I realised it totally freaked her when I just sat there and just prayed.
Yeah.
But they didn't leave then, did they?
No, it didn't.
But I was, you know, don't you just, when that sort of thing happens, I mean, to be fair, we are in a pub and it's very sociable. It's not like in Rose.
Yeah.
To leave after 45 minutes, actually, because I said to her, you can get a drink at any time. We're very free and easy here, you know.
Yeah.
And I thought, maybe they just left because I thought, well, we've been here 45 minutes.
Yeah. We're quite happy, yeah.
So I'm sure the org, I'm
Yeah,
sure
yeah.
it's partly what you said, but it really got me thinking about, and I think that's a really good point about we still need to be Christian.
Mm.
And it's interesting because I read an article this week of from the guy who runs Fusion, where they're seeing a lot of people becoming Christians, aren't they? I don't know if you've read about this, students from who weren't going anywhere. And this guy said, don't bother about being relevant, and that they want spirituality, and the weirder the better.
Yeah.
I just thought that was the
Fascinating.
Christian.
It's true.
Anyway.
There was there was a Muslim.
So how does awe come upon every soul, I guess, and awe is going to elicit different reactions in people. Some will be negative, and it'll be very interesting if you've got a pioneering mindset to see that as a really bad thing. Oh man, we've failed. But actually I want to suggest that no, we've succeeded in being faithful to who it is, because hopefully this doorway into the life of the local church, the Sunday morning, is not the only doorway. You know, there's the ways that someone can access the community of faith in this community, and also I often say now, thinking about my own story, this is me. You know, I was very like missional church. I was in that movement, but I was completely biblically illiterate when it came to mission. So I had this weird view that evangelism was almost subconsciously my job. And it neglects the idea that the sovereign Lord is working in people's heart. Me and Colin have been talking about this a lot this last few weeks, that the Lord is doing an inner work of regeneration, isn't he? That's what salvation is. And
Yeah.
so often as Protestant missional church people, we almost want to do that work for God himself. And it's like, this work might be going on for years, you know, and you just need to be we haven't got a job to do clearly. But then also, I was biblically illiterate when it came to what church was. Like, if you read the New Testament, and it was rooted in a Jewish rhythm of prayer, there will have been structure to a gathering. There will have been scripture and the explanation of scripture. That will have happened every time. Clearly, they broke bread every time they gathered, so there was communion happening all the time. And almost communion is the weirdest thing that happens in our gathering, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so exactly, it's almost like a pinnacle of the weirdness. What else was going on? Well, there was hymns, wasn't there? Sung. There was a time of sung worship where they will have had the gifts of the Spirit exercised with structure. That's like you don't have to look far in Corinthians to see that there's a method that Paul puts around how the gifts of the Spirit are to be exercised. And what that doesn't mean is there's nothing happening supernaturally. Clearly, every time there's something going on. An openness to the Spirit is really critical in the life of the gathering of the church. But all what I've just said is very weird, isn't it, to a newcomer? And so I think what we're trying to do in Antioch is trying to make it accessible, but never walk away from the weirdness. And I think there are ways you can do that, actually. So for us in New Life, we have brews before the service and after the service. There's ways of doing that fellowship time where you can make it, someone who's a newcomer feel a little more held, I suppose. And there are probably other things we can do to hold the newcomer. A couple of testimonies. This one lady, Lindsay, in Oldham's church, and we've had it in New Life Church, and I wonder if you've had it as well. We've had a numerous testimonies of in the sung worship, just a real emotional response to the Lord. Like Lindsay would say, she came to church for about 4 weeks. She's not a Christian, but she would say every time she came in the sung worship, she'd just break down in tears and just say, "What's going on? I've no reason. There's no reason why I'm crying here. I just feel like something's going on." And she would, in her own words, say, "Is that God like doing something in me?" Which is interesting again, isn't it? Like, that's in some ways that's an expression of awe, isn't it?
There's the historian Tom Holland, who's
Yeah.
like a almost Christian, who's done a lot of writing about Christianity recently, and someone asked him how should the church be, and he said, "Let Christianity be weird."
Yeah.
Like, don't, basically exactly what you're saying. Don't people aren't going to come to us for like all the stuff that the world can give them anyway. We want to push into the weird.
I think the fine line with weirdness,
Yes.
being an Anglican, is there's things in the Anglican church that I think are weird, but actually also barriers to the gospel. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I wonder, that'd be an interesting exercise to do, wouldn't it?
Do I need to pause it?
No, you don't need to put it. No. I'm leaving the church.
You got 3 hits.
Yeah, right. And you. No. So that's an interesting fine line, isn't it? What are the weird things they're actually barriers to the gospel for someone? I would suggest, if I'm being brutal, in some of our higher church traditions, in some of our Anglicanness, there's some things that I know that people who are being drawn to Jesus by the Father, they go to a church like that and they're like, what? There's something going on that I just cannot connect. There's something that feels going on in there. I'm reading my Bible, I'm being drawn to this thing called Christianity, but I go to this church and it's like, what's going on? And it's very easy to point at that church and say, well, those weird, that's barriers. But there could be barriers in our churches, couldn't there?
I went into, please don't judge me, just bear with me, but I went into Bucky's.
What?
I think it was last year, not to place an accumulator, but because it was the only place in Openstraw I could get change, because all the banks, they're just not there anymore. I just couldn't get, the only place I could get change was this Bucky's. And it was so instructive, because it just reminded me what it feels like if somebody's got zero church background. They've got no point of reference at all, except maybe they've seen something on telly, bad depiction of Christians or whatever, what it's like for them to come into one of our gatherings, it's probably a bit like going into
Really?
Buckets if you're not a regular. I genuinely feel like that was one of the most helpful things.
We should do it.
I think
Yeah.
Bishop Mark used to say that.
Oh, Ashcroft.
Yeah.
Did it?
Yeah.
Well, I often, no, I've thought that recently, because I've been to Slimming World
Yeah.
over the years, but the very first time I went,
Mhm.
and you walk in, it's in a hall, and you sort of, what do I do now
Yeah.
then? And
Yeah,
everybody else seems to know what to do.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you don't know what to do or where to
Feel
go.
like
And
a
I think this
child,
is where,
True.
so I always remember one good thing I took away from training as a lay leader, and there were a few, was that people like to feel secure
Yes.
psychologically.
Yeah.
So if they sort of know what's going to happen next. And I know we don't want to get into like your service, but I do think that's where a leader is important. And talking about weird stuff, I mean, I think, you know, within a Pentecostal church, I mean, the very first time I went to a Pentecostal church prayer meeting, and I was a Christian, I've been going to church, I was brought up in Baptist, and I'm not going to say, we're sitting in this prayer meeting, it wasn't actually this, and all of a sudden, everybody stood up, turned round, and was kneeling, and then they all started speaking in tongues and shouting, and I just sat there and I thought, this is the same God that I know, this is the same
Yeah.
Jesus I know, and I sort of got over it. So it's the way it's led, really, isn't it?
Almost Jesus said this is the key way. Maybe this is the scripture to help us. That Jesus talked about the key way to that others people will know that you are my children is if you love each other. And that we've had, I'm sure we've all had countless testimonies of people saying it was this community that I found that like cared for each other. And then I became one of them. I became a Christian, and actually, you know, one of my challenges I think to bigger churches is, you know, who have a high value on excellency, and I get that, I really do get it, but I think I want to be excellent at that thing that Jesus commanded us to be excellent at, because I think that holds people, like you say, and then from that place.
I remember going to, I won't mention any names, but I went to, it's practically what we were talking about, but the best way to welcome newcomers. Because I noticed we had some old cards that was used to welcome people, and I was thinking about reprinting them until you mention how it might be weird or awkward for just someone to say, you know, I saw your number, I want us to go for tea. So what, I don't know how do you do it at your end, how would be the best way?
Yeah.
You know?
Someone's going to be welcomed by a person primarily. You've just got to have. I just think have a team.
Okay.
Have a couple of people who, if it's not the culture of the church already, just whose job is to have an eye on the door. Someone stood at the door, but also have someone who's watching. We actually used, in Oldham's church, we don't do this in New Life, we used to have doormen, partly because it's a great way of getting your men engaged, especially your estate men as well. So some of you know Jamie, part of Grace Church, and Sean and Big Sam when he was alive. And we used to put them on the door, and actually their job was twofold. It was to welcome, but it was also to be watchmen of the thingy. And actually that was part of our safeguard, and they'd just be, and it made them feel like real men as well, which was also helpful. But I think it's people, isn't it? It's not. Cards are actually helpful if the people are in place, because we have cards, don't we? But they're just on a table at the back, and occasionally
I
someone
think
will
it's
fill one in.
useful to have them if somebody comes.
Yeah.
Get them reprinted, don't listen to comments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a
It's
secondary
how you
thing.
use them.
Yeah, it's how
All
you
right,
use them.
sure.
Yeah. And actually, it's what other doorways are there in the life of the church to invite them to? Are there things that are maybe a little easier to come to than a Sunday? And are there social things going on? Which is why doing fun stuff as a church is actually really important, because that's a really easy open door for someone to come in through and experience the community.
I know Fabric Church in sort of South Central Manchester, they describe Alpha as like the operating system of their church.
Yeah.
So everything's connected
Yeah.
to it in one way or another, including social things, if there's some sports outreach or some occasional seasonal things that they do. And that they would then from there invite people to Alpha, probably before they invite them to a Sunday service, for example.
Yeah.
But then others who are already in the church who might encourage them to volunteer, helping as a helper in Alpha. And so that's quite an interesting, I think, way of thinking about it. It wouldn't work for every church, but they've really thought through kind of using Alpha as a way as a kind of bridge point between primarily social things and then Sunday gatherings.
Yeah, that's good.
I was just thinking about the importance of the culture of your church in welcoming new people.
Yeah.
Not a Sunday gathering, but for Thursday night there's people around ours doing Bible study, and most of the people there were relatively mature Christians, and then like an hour in, two people came who were pretty new, and so we didn't have time for me to like brief everyone and be like, right, now you need to go into a different mode. Like you can't be all like weird and Christian. Like still we're studying the Bible, we're gonna pray, encounter Jesus, but like we have to sort of make this now accessible to these guys. And it was amazing actually seeing everyone. Like I kind of took the lead on it by like shaping things, but everyone kind of got the message, you know, and people started trying to reach out to the new people with maybe bits of their testimony, like trying to identify with them and stuff. And I thought that's really encouraging actually, that people are having.
That's great.
They can see a need and they've got a heart to welcome and to respond.
Just another little side note. Again, same thing. Accessible, alien. The talk, the explanation of scriptures. How have we experienced that? Like, and what's that been like? Is it? Because I've been in churches where, or I've heard of churches where almost the talk gets pushed out to the sort of edges. It's like we'll do our teaching midweek in our Bible study. And I get the impulse, but I'm not sure about that. And then there's some churches, the guy I listened to that Pete put me on to was Philip Anthony Mitchell, who they have newcomers come to their church all the time. His preachers are like an hour and 10 minutes, you know, this expositional teaching, verse by verse, with newcomers in the room. He's a very good communicator. So it's the talk, what does that look like for us? What about how we experienced it? In our gathered worship is for it to feel like we're all members of the same body, that you know, my reflection on being Anglican is often everything can default to the ordained vicar at the front. But I think other churches do that. Everything defaults to that person or this group of people. And whilst in Antioch we were committed to a New Testament idea of leadership, that there is a clear leader of this congregation. And I would suggest that is what creates safety. I think about the times when we've had chaos in Oldham's church at times, pastoral chaos, and that because of the strength of me and Amy's leadership and that structure, it created safety in the midst of those chaos times. And it'd be so easy to sort of say, but maybe we'd go for a different mode of leadership, and it's like, no, it's just not. The New Testament doesn't give us permission to do that. Like there's a reason there is a leader and elders and a structure of leadership, because it creates safety then. But then within that context, everybody should be being enabled to express their gifting as believers. And is that what it feels like in our churches, I guess, is the question. And clearly, all of us are going to say, no, we're not there yet. But what are we doing to get there, I suppose, to move in that direction? what I'm not saying is that there's some things in the life of a gathered weekly worship that are open to everybody, clearly. I think there should be a really clear boundary on who's up there preaching. I even say that about who's up there leading, because I think it communicates something. If someone is in active sin and rebellion against God, they shouldn't be up front. And whilst we're never perfect with that, are we? Because we never know the internal life of every person. But I think again, it's that hidden curriculum, isn't it? That sort of, I remember the times when I put people up front in Oldham's church, and it's risky because you don't fully know someone's life, and then there's like, often there's sometimes where people are that way. Did you know what they've been doing this last few weeks? You know, it's so hard. But I guess what I'm saying is, it's amateur enough in our worship gatherings that people will say, I could do that. I could exercise the gifting I have.
Yeah.
But it's also an encounter enough that people will say, I want that. You know, it's that balance in accessible and alien. That it's not slick, but it's not slapdash. And that's a fine line to walk. And I think again that's to do with the leader and how it's held. And I think it takes such skillful leadership actually to do that. And I think about all the times where I've not done that. But we want like an owned body, don't we? Local body. This needs to feel owned, and I don't think there's many answers that we can get into today on that. But I think it's something worth thinking about in terms of where we're going. And I'm not going to go into the questions, but they're just some helpful thoughts that me and John and the rest of the guys have had around